Hey, Robert.
Hi.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So, on today's episode of Exploring A Course in Miracles, we are going to talk about habits, which is something that people are thinking about at this time of year, making new habits for ourselves, developing new habits. But the Course has some very specific habits that Jesus would like us to develop. So, we're going to talk about those today.
Yeah, so it's a timely topic, but it turns out to be a fascinating topic in the course itself. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this discussion too. Do we have any housekeeping to talk about before we dive into the content of the episode?
Well, they know about the new title, so we
Yeah.
don't have to mention that. And you had a question that you wanted to bring in from the previous podcast.
Yeah. A listener asked a question that I wanted to bring up with you. And in our last podcast, we talked about equality. And in the very first point of the discussion guide, you said God created us equal and loves us all equally. In heaven, we have the same worth and the same attributes. We're like a huge family of identical siblings. And you cited a quote from the Course from chapter 1. It says, "When the atonement has been completed, all talents will be shared by all of the sons of God. And all of his children have his total love, and all of his gifts are freely given to everyone alike." And I'm sorry, I forget the person who asked this question, but I thought the question itself was fascinating. And the question is, okay, so if in heaven all of our talents are shared equally and all of God's attributes are distributed equally, why is talent distributed so unequal here on earth? You know, you have somebody who is an amazing runner or has an incredible voice, or it just seems like we are so divergent in our talents. So what do you have to say about that from a course perspective?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing is to picture a vast distance between who we are as God created us and who we show up as in this world. So in heaven, in our true nature, we are vast, literally limitless, infinite beings. Our strengths are would be unrecognizable to us now. They are so unlimited. And so we show up in this world as massively narrowed, curtailed versions of who we really are. The Course says that your abilities in this world are shadows of your true strengths. So we have dialed down the unlimited nature of our true strengths to an unbelievable degree. And just some of us dial them down less. Some people have put fewer limits on the abilities they show up with in this world.
Doesn't it
So,
just seem inherently unfair, though, and therefore unequal, that someone is born with the voice of a Whitney Houston or Mariah Carey or Christina Aguilera, and some of us just don't have that? Or, and I mean, it's not even just like about talent, like singing talent. It's about all kinds of different talents that we have that just come off as so unequal. And therefore, if you don't have those inherent talents, then you start this life at a bit of a disadvantage. And how can that be fair?
well, it's, the way we start this life, it would be a product of all kinds of past choices. I mean, with the Course, the big example, of course, is Helen Schuckman herself. She, if we're to believe the past life memories she had been exercising and nurturing this ability to channel spirit for countless eons. So the reason she showed up in this life with that ability is because of choices she made before. It's not because of some divine lottery system.
I like that divine lottery system. Hmm. Okay. Well, I hope that that answers the question to the person who asked it. What else do we have? We have our Course Companions launch, which is still going on through January. So if anyone would like to join with us and go through any volume of the course, the text, the workbook, or the manual, we have that going on. You can visit coursecompanions.com and sign up. Not too late for that. Never too late for that. It's open all year long, but
Yeah.
January is the time when most people tend to sign up because that's when we have the most momentum for the program.
Yeah, that's when people are thinking about new beginnings. And, people typically have difficulty going through the volumes of the course. And so that's our main program, because that is what it means to take the course.
Yeah, and the classes that you host each week for the workbook and the text, those are on the calendar year schedule. So there's a real advantage to joining at the beginning of the year when you can keep on the schedule of the classes.
Makes it simpler, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of fun in a big group of people going through the book together on the same schedule. And we see that in the Facebook group and the conversations that people have on the lessons or the section or related to the calendar year.
Yeah, it is nice to go together. There's strength in being part of a group.
Yeah. So, all right, that's Course Companions. And I did say in the last podcast that I would put our webinar that we just recently hosted, A Fresh Start with A Course in Miracles in the New Year, on circleofa.org/fresh start. I did do that. So that's available for anyone who wants to listen to that replay. All right. Anything you want to say about that?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll get right into the content for today, which is on the topic of habits. So where would you like to start with this, Robert?
Well, I think let's just talk for a minute about our relationship with habits, because I think we all have the sense that we have formed these habits. They tend to dominate our days and our lives. And I think we all have the sense that maybe they aren't the best habits. We probably all can think of some bad habits that we'd like to kick. We probably could all think of habits that we'd like to develop, new ones we'd like to form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we all get into that cycle at the new year where we set these new goals that for creating new habits, and we tend to fall out of that very early in the year, and then we do it again next year. And
Yeah.
so it's nice to talk about ways in which we can develop habits, not only in alignment with what Jesus wants us to do, but really dive into how we can make them stick.
Yeah, because when you're talking about the ones we form with our New Year's resolutions, I don't know how much we actually form them. Because when you really form a habit, it's self-sustaining to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so easy just to fall out of it. You have to break it if you really form it.
And you have to really want it to make it stick. And so there's some element of us that doesn't want ultimately to keep the habits that we set for ourselves. Otherwise, we would.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think something in us that doesn't want to really form them in the first place.
Yeah.
Because we tend not to actually form them.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that we have, there is the allure of the old habits, right? Those old habits seem to have a power that is greater than us.
We default into them because they're easier.
And the grooves are well worn.
Yeah, it's a really good
so
point.
it's hard to climb out of them because your mind just runs along in those grooves and says, I want what the habit tells me to want. And it's easier just to keep wanting that than fight it.
I know we have the best intentions with our habits at the new year, and then we just slowly erode at those intentions and end up back in the same old patterns. And that itself is the habit.
Yeah, I think that gives us a context for this discussion, because to some degree we feel like a prisoner of our habits. If we could just suddenly find ourselves outfitted with new habits, healthier ones, more constructive ones, more in line with our highest aspirations and our true goals. Who wouldn't do that? It's, who wouldn't elect for that condition? It's the process of getting, of unwinding the old habits and actually forming the new ones that we resist.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about that. So, where do you want to go from here?
Well, I think let's just acknowledge that. Well, first of all, I'll say that there are 18 references that I found to habit or habits in the course. And then there's also one that is in Personal Guidance to Helen and Bill that isn't actually in the course proper. But 18 references is nothing to sneeze at. There's a lot we can glean from those 18 references. So what I've done is I've gone into those and examined those closely and looked at what the overall picture is that comes out of those 18 references. And the most simple version of that is the course wants us to form new habits that basically will get us home to God. Not just new habits like, exercise more, but ones that will carry us along the pathway home and deliver us at heaven's gate. So it's talking about forming those kinds of habits.
Yeah, and we were talking about this before we hit record, and you were highlighting all the ways in which the course wants us to make these habits that we form involuntary and automatic, so that we're not so much thinking, okay, I have to do this, but it's just something that we automatically do because our minds are conditioned in a certain way.
Well, that's really the whole idea behind a habit. And that brings up the whole topic of why do we need habits? I think that we tend to think perhaps of the spiritual journey in terms of, well, I make certain choices, maybe certain pivotal choices, and those move me forward on the spiritual journey. So how do habits fit into that? What is the why behind forming these new habits? And the why is really simple. Let me go ahead and read a passage here. This is from chapter 30 in the text. He says, decisions are continuous. You do not always know when you are making them, but with a little practice in the ones you recognize, a set begins to form which sees you through the rest. So I just want to talk about that for a second. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, it's really interesting that it says decisions are continuous. You don't always know when you're making them. Can you talk about that? And then I want to talk about a set begins to form and what specifically he means by a set.
Right. So, yes, I think the really interesting thing about that passage is decisions are continuous. We don't think that way. We don't think I'm continuously making decisions. We think if I make the right decision, when I make decisions every 10 minutes or 2 hours or 3 days, however long we think the decisions have between them, then I'm okay. But this says we're making them all the time without any let up whatsoever. So that's why
And
we
we
don't
don't always
know.
know when we're
Right.
making them. Yeah,
Because
I
we're not
think
aware that we're making them at each moment.
yeah, and that's what's really interesting about this passage too we tend to think of decisions as we are faced with a choice and we make a decision for A or B. And what this is saying is that that's constantly going on in our mind at all times, and we're not even aware that is what is actually happening, right?
Right, right. So it's going on all the time. It's going on right now.
What kind
And
of decisions do you think?
well, in the course, it's mainly decisions about how to see things
Hmm.
and then decisions about how to express those perceptions that we've chosen.
And and so when it says a set begins to form which sees you through, what does it mean by that?
Okay, well, the idea is that if you can form, I mean, here he mentions the word set. Right before this passage in the previous paragraph, he talks about habit. But the idea is a set, which is, and this is from one of the footnotes in the CE, a mental inclination, bias, or habit, a psychological state that predisposes one to react a certain way to an anticipated stimulus. So a set is a habit. It's
Mm-hmm.
this predisposed state that inclines you to respond a certain way to things. Okay, so the idea is, if we can form that set, or if we can form that habit, we don't have to worry about all of the moments in which we're making decisions but aren't aware of it. That habit will make those decisions for us, even if we're not aware of making them. And that basically is the reason for forming the habit. Essentially, we're mostly on autopilot. Okay, 98, 99% of the time, we're on autopilot. The question is, while we're on autopilot, who's flying the plane?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the ego, or is it the Holy Spirit? Now, unless we form the kind of habits the Course is talking about, the autopilot is the ego.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have to do is get from a place where we're making the occasional right choice to a place where we're essentially making the right choice all the time. And how do we get from the occasional right choice to continuous right choices? That's what habits are for.
And this set point, is this something that we cultivate like a muscle to get ourselves into a better, more fertile ground from which to make better decisions? Or do you feel that the set point is something that we are born with based on, as we were saying before about eons of lifetimes? Do we come in with a certain set point, or do we develop that set point as we're here, or is it both?
I think it's both, but I don't think set point is the right term. It's just set, and that's a psychological term. So it's not you're set at a certain point. It's that a better synonym would be mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a certain mindset. And yeah, I think we come in with certain predispositions. Of course we do. But once we've come in, we have a choice. And you see the fact that we have a choice in for instance, twin studies, where the twins can have oftentimes amazingly similar personalities and histories, even if raised apart. But other times, even when raised together, they can take very different trajectories, have different personalities. I had two aunts that were identical twins, and they were very different. You wouldn't even know they were twins.
Mm-hmm.
So choice comes in. Whatever you come in with in terms of what you're born with, choice still is a major factor.
Okay. So what we are trying to get into the habit of is getting our minds into a place where the Holy Spirit is the guide. Is that correct?
Yeah, he's the autopilot. And
Mm-hmm.
that means several things. It's not just about guidance about what to do, but overall we want him to be in charge. But anyway, the essential idea, and I really want to draw this out because I found this very fascinating in looking at these various passages on habits. The essential point is the notion of habit is there to solve the question, how do I get from occasional right decisions or right choices to continuous right choosing? How do I get there? How do I fill in that the rest of that 98, 99% of the choosing process? And so what I want to do is read through just a series of very quick quotes here that talk about that continuous right choosing. So we want the right response in us to be the following. These are all quotes. We want to be involuntary. That's a major word in relation to habits. Imagine that you involuntarily make the right choice. We want to be automatic. Same idea. Imagine that you are automatically making the right choice at all times. We want the right choice to be a quick reaction. It's become instinct. We want to be your first response to every situation that occurs. Again, that right choice has become your initial instinct. We want to be ready and for any need. So anytime we're confronted with a situation, with a need, that right choice is there. We want to be consistent. It's happening all the time. We want to make it even in very little things. We often muster up the right choice for big things, but that leaves all those little things. We want that right choice to be happening even in very little things. We want the right choosing to be the rules by which you live and a thought that rules your mind. So it has become the ruling force in you. And all those things, to me, they paint a picture of my mind just automatically, habitually, effortlessly, consistently making that right choice. Wouldn't that be, well, isn't that what we're trying to get to?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Wouldn't it be extraordinary to continuously, involuntarily make the right choice for God at any
That
given point?
sounds that sounds so inspiring.
Doesn't it? I know. And so, how do we get there?
Yes. Okay. Well, uh, the simple answer, which is probably not the welcome answer, is we have to form new habits, and that means consistent effort. First, you form the habit, and it does take effort, and it takes consistency. But once once the habit is formed, with all that effort, then it does become relatively effortless. So the work lies at the beginning.
Right. And this is where we fall down with habits overall is we want the benefit, but then we fall down on the work. But it seems like what Jesus is saying here is if we just put the work in at the beginning, we lay down the mental track, and then the behavior becomes more automatic as we get deeper into the habit.
Right. I mean, habit formation obviously has stages. There's a place where you form the habit, it's become natural, but it still requires a certain amount of effort. Then there's a place where the habit is so absolutely established that it does become involuntary.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're shooting for that place where it's involuntary, which suggests effortless, automatic, etc.
Okay. And we can see this with our own practice. I mean, I don't. I hope I'm not taking you off of your schedule here, but I know for a long time, waking up in the morning to do my course study was an effort that I would have to talk myself into doing. And I'm at a place now where it's just an automatic part of my morning. I wake up, I do my quiet time, and it's like that every day. But the beginning of it was like moving a heavy stone to get there. But then once you start to get into the benefit of it, then it's the benefit that inspires you to keep putting in the work,
And it feels unnatural to
to
not
not
do
do
it.
it.
You
Mhm.
feel out of kilter, things feel strange, you're out of place.
Right.
Yeah.
But the initial piece of it is always harder as you're sort of laying down those grooves in your mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what we do, at least what I do, is if I'm trying to form some new habit, I don't want to be strict with it. And so I mix in the new with the old, and then I just kind of stay open to which one feels like is my preference in the moment, new or old. And I can stay in that new or old thing for years and never really ground the new as the habit.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where it's helpful to have an accountability partner, because one of the things that got me over the hump a few years ago was having you on my back. Like, have you done your morning quiet time?
It does help. Sure. Other people, if their will is being given to the new habit, then that helps us give our own will to it.
Yeah, and it's more carrot than stick, or at least it was with us. But at the same
Yeah.
time, it is really, really helpful to join with someone in the formation of that habit.
Yeah, it does help. Okay, in terms of forming the new habit, one thing I want to point out, and this was very interesting to me, is the phrase consistent effort or consistent efforts occurs 4 times in the course. And 3 of those times, it's directly associated with habit formation. So when he sees us developing a new habit, he sees us making consistent effort. And one of the things he says is what holds us back is the belief that no one, including ourselves, is worth consistent effort. So it does require consistent effort, and we have to believe that we're worth it.
That's interesting. Do you think that part of the reason why we fall off the wagon so much with our habits of all forms is that something inside of us doesn't think we're worth it?
Oh, I think absolutely. He says that it's not a matter, the problem's not concentration. In other words, we could concentrate if we had the belief that we were worth it. And I think, the very same belief that keeps us from reaching out to others with the help that we could, which is we're not quite sure they're worth it. We have that belief when it comes to us. We're not quite sure we're worth it.
Yeah, we have so much to override in order to form a new habit. And my goodness. And then on top of that, to make it automatic. It's a mountain to
Right.
climb, isn't it?
It is, but it's the only one worth climbing.
Aw,
I'm
you're
really
right.
excited about this idea of the habits. And we haven't talked yet about what specific habits that he does encourage, because I've been wanting to form these habits as habits forever.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And
Go
I
ahead.
just feel like this is going to help me do that.
Yeah. And I love that you pulled out that the course specifically refers to the word habit 18 times. And so let's get into what it says when it asks us to form new habits.
Okay. So, what is, I think, really interesting is that if you look through these 18 references to the word habit or habits, you see basically 3 habits referred to over and over again. Each one of them is referred to multiple times. And he hardly refers to any other habits. So when he talks about habits, he has these 3 habits in mind. And I just think it's fascinating that we can identify specifically what habits he wants us to form. And the number is as low as 3. I'm sure there are more than that, but those are the 3 he returns to again and again. So
No,
I think, anyway,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
you go ahead.
I'm like sort of giddy about making these my own habits for the new year and sort of dropping what quote unquote Emily wants about going to the gym and eating better and all those sort of self-focused habits that we tend to make, and really diving into what it is that Jesus wants us to do. So we've teased people enough. So
Yeah, okay.
what is it that
I,
Jesus is specifically asking us to do? What habits does he want us to form?
I think we should just go ahead and close right now and leave them
Right. See you
guessing.
guys next time.
Okay, so in no particular order, the first one is giving miracles. Now, in course lingo, we tend to think of miracles as shifts in perception, and that is part of the course's meaning of the term. But the main meaning of the term, as we often point out in these podcasts, is expressions of love, expressing love to someone else. And that is one of the 3 habits that he wants us to learn. He wants giving love to others to become so habitual that it's involuntary. And this goes back to one of the very earliest miracle principles, number 4. Miracles are habits and should be involuntary. And he mentions this idea. He doesn't mention them being habits so much, but he mentions after this, but he mentions them being involuntary many times. And he even says that he has said it, quote, many times, or he said it, quote, repeatedly. So when he thinks of miracles, he thinks they should be involuntary. And what that means, of course, is that as we are confronted with people and their needs throughout the day, it becomes involuntary to give love in response. Involuntary.
That's so beautiful. And I love your quotes here where it says miracle workers must learn Christ control to replace their former habits. Now, when you say Christ control, or when the Course says Christ control, I know there's a lot of people who that brings up a lot of fear. They don't want to, the word control, I think, is scary to some. So what would you say to somebody who gets a little squeamish around that idea?
Well, I think it just takes time to be comfortable with somebody else being in control of, in this case, your behavior, right? I mean, that loss of control is a big deal for us, and we're going to have to basically approach it gradually by learning to trust Christ, learning to trust that we're happier, we feel more fulfilled. I mean, this quote ends by saying it replaced their former habits, which did produce scarcity in place of abundance. So when we're in control, we end up feeling empty inside. When we let Christ take control, we end up feeling full, abundant within our own selves. So it's that.
And the results are better.
The results are better. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because we end up to the point of this habit being more loving people. And how can you not have a better life if you're extending more love to others? And so what are we so afraid of if that's the result, if that's what we're trying to get to, is to become more loving people who are a healing presence as a result?
Right. So what he's expecting is that we'll learn from giving over control in isolated instances that we're happier, and that will lead us further and further into giving over more and more control until we give over complete control. But it's not going to happen overnight, right? I mean, we are all control freaks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so even though what we're turning over, which is just getting in the habit of being more loving people, but that comes from getting ourselves in a mindset that is God focused. And so we need to get to the place where that's the automatic, and then the love flows from that. Is that what you're saying in this point?
Well, yeah. And I think the other two habits speak directly to that as well. But one thing I think is good to point out here is that if we give over control, we will not just find ourselves being helpful, reaching out with expressions of love in cases where before we would just go about our merry way. We also will find ourselves not giving miracles in places where before we would have tried to.
Explain that.
Well, this passage that you read is in the context of originally a discussion about Edgar Cayce. And he had this massive desire to help. And so when he was faced with requests for readings that were so many he couldn't fulfill them, he did his utmost to try to fulfill them and burnt himself out to the point where his health collapsed and he died at age 67 or 8. So Jesus's point was, if he'd listened to me and given me control, he would have lived way longer and gone further towards fulfilling his own full purpose. So giving over control to Christ may mean, well, it will mean at times, we're much more giving, outgoing, less focused on our personal needs. At other times, it may mean that we're less giving because Jesus has ascertained that this person's not open to our miracle, and therefore giving the miracle in that case would be basically wasted effort that would contribute towards burnout.
And so there's a part of the Course where he says, ask me which miracles that you should perform, and that's part of giving him control.
And it's this place, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so give me a practical example. What does that look like?
Well, I think what it looks like is you feel a miracle impulse, that impulse to reach out. And then before you actually go to reach out, you just briefly check in. Is this the right place? Or is this just me meddling? Is this me giving something where I know there's no real openness, there's a wall.
Mm-hmm. That's okay. So Jesus wants to get us in the habit of being miracle workers in the world,
Right.
people who uh, express love that has a healing effect on other people. But there's a caveat to that. He wants us to ask whether or not we should express love to a particular person before we do,
Which is another one of the habits.
which is, oh. But it seems like how much, okay, so we would be asking all day long then, essentially.
Well, and that leads us right into, you know, one of the other habits. Sure.
Do you want to go into it or do you want to stay here?
Why don't we go into it? Yeah.
Okay, go
I've
into
got
it.
it listed as number 3, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, the order is completely irrelevant. It's random. Okay, so another one of the habits of the big 3 is asking for guidance. And this too, he wants us to ask, and he says in several different ways, he wants us to form the habit of asking. The final section of the manual says, if you have made the habit of asking for help when and where you can be confident that wisdom will be given you when you need it. And to me, well, one other point is that the section that you and I are so focused on right now, Rules for Decision, it has a whole preamble about forming habits, making the specific methods he's going to give us into habits. Well, those methods are all about asking for guidance all day long.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite quote, which is not even in the course proper, is in Cameo 8. It's a personal aside to Helen and Bill, where Helen forgave Bill for forgetting to ask if it was time for them to type up her dictation, her notes. And what Jesus says is, note further. First, he praises her for basically not blaming him. So she
Not
wasn't
blaming Bill.
not blaming Bill, right? Thank you. So first of all, she wasn't concerned that Bill forgot, and that was a great thing on her part, according to Jesus. Then Jesus says, note further, he needn't feel concerned about it either. So he forgot. Happens all the time until the habit of asking becomes involuntary. And when I first read that, I mean, I had never seen that until I saw it on her notebook page. And it's an unforgettable line, because it's like, yeah, of course you'll forget to ask. It'll just happen all the time until you develop this habit of asking, until you develop it so well that asking becomes involuntary.
Where do you feel like you are in that process?
Well, I'm better than I was since we've been doing, I'm better now with us doing this Rules for Decision practice. It's feeling a lot more habitual. But so I feel like the habit is forming, but there's a long way until the habit becomes involuntary.
Yeah, and that's something I think that's important to highlight, because we're in this process here at the Circle of making guidance part of our individual and collective experience. And so we're constantly saying, let's ask about it, let's ask about it, let's ask about it, and then seeing what it is that comes through. And I'll speak from my own experience, but one thing that has happened to me as a result of this process is we'll say, I'll ask about it, and then I'll ask about it, and the guidance is coming quicker. And
Mm,
so what we tend to say is we're not going to stop each other from receiving guidance if somebody's in the process of it. So we just say, look done, which means like, look like you've got something or you
right.
didn't.
If we're getting it together.
Yeah, if we're getting
Yeah.
it together. And so for a while it was asking in silence for a few minutes. And now what I'm discovering is that I'll ask and it'll come through quicker. And sometimes nothing comes at all, and that's just part of the process too. But I have noticed it's coming faster. And I think that's just the result of that muscle being developed I think guidance
Yeah.
is as much of a muscle as our physical muscles are. Attitudinal muscles, guidance muscles, they're all the same thing. You use them and they work and get stronger.
Yeah. That's a really great observation. I think I'm noticing the same thing. What's weird for me is I've had asking for guidance as a part of my daily practice. So I've been asking several or many times a day forever while not wanting to ask about everything.
You don't want to ask about the things that you don't want to turn over control about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same.
Excuse
Same.
me here.
If I am genuinely open to guidance, I have no problem asking. And if there's a particular outcome that I want, I am less inclined to ask.
Right. And so I'm less inclined to ask if there's something I'm attached to. And I also have difficulty asking if I have like time in front of me that's wide open. I could do one of 10 or 20 things. Asking how to fill that time has felt like, oh, because he could tell me anything. In the past, and I've done a lot of that, I've often got do that thing you've been avoiding. Well, who wants to hear that?
Mm-hmm. So we
Right?
don't ask in the first place because we're afraid we're going to get answers like that.
Right. So I've been more comfortable with, oh, I'm working on this thing and I don't know what to say. I don't know where to go with it. I really could use the help. I want the help, so I'll ask. That feels safer than some of the other things.
But then the more you ask and the more you see the benefit of just doing the thing that you didn't want to do, but it came through, so you did it, and then you see the positive outcome, the more inclined you would be to ask, and therefore that muscle gets stronger of asking.
That's true. But I think there's an extra factor. And that is even when asking proves its value, and it's proven its value to me a million times, there is still a resistance in principle to turning over control.
Yeah,
There's
I know.
still that.
I feel
It's like
that too.
even if it fails, if I was in control, there's something good about that.
Yeah, because we want to have control over our lives. I know for as passionate as I think we both are on this subject and really, really desiring to turn our lives over, there's still this nope, I want to decide what I'm going to do with my day. And yet that I really feel like have asking has become a habit and I am seeing the positive benefits of it. And that is one thing that makes me want to continue to do it even more.
Yeah, it's like what I'm seeing is so many decisions work out better, differently, and definitely better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to argue with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been cycling between asking and oh, I don't want to ask and asking for so long. It's pitiful. And this is better. Just go for it. Form the habit, put in the consistent effort, and watch it become habitual and watch things go better.
So I want to tie this to the last point because I was saying that Jesus is asking us to get in the habit of asking when we should express miracles. And the reason to do that is so that we don't burn ourselves out like Edgar Casey did, correct?
Basically, it's if you give miracles where you think the person really could use one, but they aren't open, then your effort becomes, in a sense, wasted. And I know it's not ultimately wasted, but you can do that. And, we have limited energy right now. We don't in reality, but in our current condition, we do. And yeah, we can burn ourselves out.
Hmm. Okay. Because that's really interesting because you hear something like express miracles and you think we're supposed to be doing that all day long. And Jesus is actually saying, ask me, because there are some instances where you shouldn't be.
Right. I mean, we
Hmm.
should be doing all that day. We should be doing that all day long. When the Course says each day should be devoted to miracles, it means devoted to expressing love. But he says, let me set my limits. So we shouldn't set limits. We should let him set his limits.
Hmm. Have you ever, just out of curiosity, asked about expressing love to someone and heard, no, not right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, the pattern is it's when I really am invested in this person receiving the help that they don't want.
Hmm.
And because I'm so invested, I overlook the fact that they don't want it. And then at some point in the process, when I check in and ask, it's like, no, they don't want it.
Hmm. Well, if you continue to try and get them to change, even with love, then you will exhaust yourself, because if they don't want it, they don't want it. And there's
Right.
really nothing you can do at that point. Although there is something in them, the Christ in them, that does receive your love, no matter whether you.
Yeah, but at that point, if I'm trying to give them a gift that they're pushing away, how loving is it versus just meddling?
Mm, yeah. Okay. So is there anything else that you want to say on the habit of asking for guidance?
Just that what I said at the start, it's striking how many times he indicates that he wants us to form this habit.
Hmm. So we're supposed to be asking all day long.
Right. About all kinds of things. I mean, I just did my last workbook class for the year, and the last 5 lessons, as well as the epilogue, are all about here as you're transitioning out of the workbook and going past the workbook. What you replace it with is asking for guidance about when to do your practice periods and what to do in your practice periods.
Mm-hmm.
So he just thinks asking is for everything.
Is there ever anything that you think is too small to ask about?
I don't know. I don't know. I think what I'm doing with our rules for decision practice is I notice that I'm defending from total loss of control by sort of unconsciously saying, well, that's kind of too small.
That's
And
interesting.
yeah, and I think that we need to beware of that. He does say that it's not feasible to ask about every little thing all throughout the way. You can't ask about every sentence you speak. That's
Well,
ridiculous.
that's why I asked, because I do feel that there is some temptation out there that I've seen to ask about things that are just, it just seems almost way too small. Should I eat this apple or that apple? Should I park here? Should I park there? Should I go to this restaurant or that restaurant? And I don't take it to that level, although that's sometimes we
Well,
do.
actually, yeah. I
That's
mean,
true. We did ask at one point which restaurant to go to.
yeah, and it was a good thing we did.
Yeah, but that's not routine. Are we saying that it should be routine? Is Jesus saying that it
Why
should be?
not? Well, I mean, yes, you can go too far. I had a friend who would stand in the supermarket and be meditating over which tomato to pick, eyes closed in the middle of the store.
Yeah, that's
That's
exhausting.
something, yeah. So he does say that's impractical to ask about every little tiny thing. Ask when and where you can,
Hmm.
and you'll be confident that wisdom is given you when you need it. So I think we just have to find that those
Now,
lines through experience.
when it says wisdom will be given you when you need it, do you hit a place where the wisdom becomes automatic too?
Well, that whole idea in that passage I read, if you've made the habit of asking for help when you can be confident that wisdom will be given you when you need it. So that very overtly uncouples the time of the asking and the time of the receiving, which suggests you may receive that wisdom at some later time, implying it just comes to you.
Hmm.
You experience it as coming involuntarily.
And we've all experienced that.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. But
That's the
do we
best.
realize that we increase our chances of that by just asking all the time, whether or not we get an answer at the moment of asking?
Hmm. Okay.
Okay.
So, what is the third habit?
The third habit is response to temptation. And this is a term that is not particularly used in course circles. It is an important term in the course, though. It's introduced at the end of the text, and it plays a major role in the workbook. And the basic idea is that response to temptation is responding with a thought from the course to a disturbance of your peace in order to dispel that disturbance and return yourself to peace. So when you see in the text statements like, whenever you feel threatened or disturbed, say this, and you have italicized, indented lines to repeat, or when the workbook says, whenever you're upset, repeat these words, which the workbook does throughout, practically the main practice in the workbook. That's response to temptation. Okay. And I've been aware of that for many, many years. I've practiced it for many, many years. What I noticed, though, several years ago was just how much the word habit was associated with the term response to temptation. And I realized, oh my gosh, he wants us to form this habit so that it becomes automatic to respond with my lesson for the day, for instance, to even very small upsets. And I thought, I have not formed that habit. It's not involuntary.
Yeah, you've got here in your discussion guide examples of when response to temptation appears in the course, and habit is coupled with it in the same sentence in every example you have. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them here. Do you want to read a couple?
Yeah, so this is the first reference to response to temptation in the course in chapter 31 of the text. He says, an idea that I'm not going to read, must become a habit of response so typical of everything you do that it becomes your first response to all temptation and to every situation that occurs. Well, there's habit and response to temptation, but notice there's that idea we were talking about earlier where he wants this to become like a blanket thing. It's just involuntary that you do it across the board.
Yeah, but I imagine there's a lot of listeners out there who are thinking, well, what is it? What is my response to temptation in this particular case? Can you?
Yeah, it's that you never hate your brother for his sins, but only for your own. And he says he wants you to overlearn that. And if you do, you'll save yourself more time than you can comprehend. Like a stretch of time so vast, you can't even imagine it.
Okay, let's go through these examples, but I know we want to talk about overlearning as well.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one's from the final section of the text. Learn then the happy habit of response to all temptation. The next one's from lesson 95 in the workbook. He says, you have not yet formed the habit of using the idea for the day, as an automatic response to temptation. Notice again, he thinks of habit and automatic or involuntary together. And I'll just read one more. This is from lesson 194. I place the future in the hands of God. As it becomes a thought that rules your mind, a habit in your problem-solving repertoire, a way of quick reaction to temptation. So, again and again, just like you said, he pairs habit and response to temptation.
So if somebody is new to the idea of response to temptation, can you just walk us through what that is? Like, what specifically are you supposed to do? So you recognize that you're not at peace, and then what?
Well, first of all, you're basically on the lookout for not being at peace. And in the workbook, I've collected all the different forms of disturbance of your peace that he gives, and they extend to things we would never think.
Like what?
Like feeling a desire for some worldly thing. He thinks that disturbs our peace. Or being tempted to engage in planning for a safer future. He thinks that disturbs our peace. And there's a long list of things. We could do a whole podcast in response to temptation. It's a huge topic in the course. So you're on the lookout for any kind of disturbance of your peace, and he means any kind. And then when you notice it, he wants you to instantly, quickly, immediately respond. And this is why he wants it to be a habit, right? Because habits a well-formed habit becomes your first response.
Mm-hmm. In the
So, yeah.
beginning, you're thinking, as you're forming this habit, you police your mind, you notice that you're not at peace, and you have to actually think, okay, I have to think this thing. And you get to a place though where the thought just comes, but initially it's more of a decision.
It's a decision, but he wants it to be a decision that you don't procrastinate on. See, what we want to do is be upset about something and mull it over and think how I'm going to fix it in the world outside, and think about who to blame, and moan about our bad luck. Just
Mm-hmm.
kind of simmer in it. And he wants us to kind of not give ourselves that luxury, but to instead if we're in the workbook, take our idea for the day, and he'll often give us a special form of that idea specifically for response to temptation. Um, which he often calls the as needed applications.
Can you give me your favorite or
Oh,
examples?
it's endless. I mean, a favorite of many course students is I could see peace instead of this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a lot of them in the workbook. I mean, sorry, in the text, like I do not know what anything including this means, et cetera, et cetera. So there's hundreds in the course. It's a major feature of A Course in Miracles, and many students, I think, have a collection of their favorite ones. One of
You
my
actually
all-time
literally have a
favorites.
collection of them, don't you?
Well, I don't have a collection of all my favorites. I've started to make that collection a few times and never quite followed through with it.
You were about
But
to say what your all-time favorite was.
one of my all-time favorites is 194. I place the future in the hands of God.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why he thinks that needs to become a habit in your problem-solving repertoire, because it's an amazing way of solving problems. It's, I feel not at peace about the situation. Well, I place it in the hands of God.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
One of my favorites is I will be still in a moment and go home.
yeah, that's a great one. So there are hundreds of thoughts from the course that will work, but the idea is to use one, preferably your lesson for that day if you're doing the workbook, and you say the idea or the special form given you for response to temptation. You say it with confidence and certainty, and you might want to add some thoughts of your own spontaneously to piggyback on that thought you've just said, and then you open your mind to correction.
So, what if somebody's listening and they are in the habit, trying to form the habit of response to temptation, and it's just not working for them? So they pick their lesson. Let's say it's I place the future in the hands of God, and they're trying to recite that every time their peace is disturbed, but nothing is really breaking up for them. What would you recommend at that point?
Well, first of all, I think if response to temptation isn't working consistently, you're almost certainly not doing it right. Okay, it's like swinging a golf club. You can swing a golf club and get no result, or you can get a hole in one. It's all in the swing. So you need to know how to do this right. And there's a lot of instruction in the course on how to repeat the words that the course gives us, because this is a practice of repeating words. If we're down on words, we're going to marginalize this core practice in the course.
But one
So
way is slowly, methodically.
slowly thinking about, what you're saying, making it a declaration. At one point, he talks about saying the words as a declaration of independence from the tyranny of the world. He talks about making an acknowledgement of what's true. So there's all kinds of guidance on how to say the words, and they're not magic words. The course clearly does not believe in magic words. It's the meaning that they call to mind. So you have to say the words in such a way that they do call to mind that meaning. For instance, in lesson 41, which is God goes with me wherever I go, you say those words And how does he say? Think about what they mean. Think of the companionship or the holiness that they imply about you, about the protection that surrounds you, about the companionship that is yours. So if you think about God goes with me wherever I go, and you think that must mean I'm holy. If he's my creator and he's with me, he must be imparting his holiness to me. He must be surrounding me with protection. He must be giving me his companionship. If you draw out the meaning in that specific way, it's impossible to say it with no impact.
That's a really good point, because I think oftentimes when it's not working for us, and I know I'm guilty of this myself, it's because we're trying to use the lesson or the practice as a hammer to break up whatever's in your mind that is disturbing your peace. And I love what you're saying here about pausing and really thinking about the meaning, because if you do that long enough, then you dwell in it more, and then that's what breaks it up.
One analogy I've used in the past is you're just turning a light on and letting the light dispel the darkness. You aren't like clubbing the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to think of, I've started a lot of fires in my life. Most of us have, and you have to like nurture
Literal or figurative?
both. You have to, blow on or have bellows. You have to give air to that fire and nurture it. And as we repeat the idea, we're turning a light on, but we have to nurture that light so it actually comes on and dispels the darkness. You can't just, light the match, chuck it in the fireplace, and you're done.
Yeah. Oh, this is such a good thing to talk about, because particularly here at the beginning of the year, what we want to do is get into mantras, and I'm going to have a mantra for the day. And the mantra is just an overlay of a saying that isn't really addressing the root cause of why the piece is disturbed in the first place. It's just trying to will it with a sentence. And so I think that we have a tendency, some of us have a tendency to want to do that with our lessons in the course. And so it's just good to have this discussion around making it more meaningful and how we do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to think that the workbook is just a bunch of affirmations that we kind of mindlessly repeat
Mm-hmm.
to make ourselves feel better. When in fact, the lessons, they really contain a kind of a rationale for why you would feel better. And it's our job as we repeat them to dwell in that meaning, to let our minds sink into that meaning, to give it a certain amount of confidence and certainty and acknowledgement and declaration. And when we do that, that meaning shines brightly in our mind, and it automatically chases away the meanings that are of the ego.
Oh, that's so good. So the habits that Jesus is asking us to form are giving miracles, response to temptation, and asking for guidance.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And you have found a connection to these habits, these specific habits, in a guidance that Jesus gave to Helen and Bill that you put into Cameo 14. Cameos are the essays in the back of the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles. And you put that in Cameo 14, and it's called Chain of Miscreation. And I'm hoping that you can kind of walk us through the parallels with that cameo.
Okay, so what the chain of miscreation guidance was about was Jesus was going through. He wanted Helen and Bill to review what are now the first two chapters of A Course in Miracles, and he kind of scheduled review time for them to do that, but they never got to it. Apparently, looks like there was too much conflict going on between them, and by the end of the day, no review had happened. So he decided to go through the places in their day where things went off track. And it wasn't about that particular day. He made a big point. He said, I'm only going to do this once, because it's not about this day and those choices. It's about their typical nature. It's about the fact that every day is like this. So let me show you. And then he goes through their day and where things went off track. and then where things were where they made the right choices. And it's an absolutely fascinating and unforgettable discourse. And yes, you get a picture of how things typically go off track, but in the process, you get a very clear picture of how he sees a day that would go right. And what's interesting to me, I've studied and taught and written about that guidance for years, starting 15 or more years ago.
And where was that guidance found? Just out of curiosity, because it's
It's
not
in
in the course proper.
Well, it is. No, it's not. No, we didn't put it in the course proper because it's too personal. It's in the text and in Helen's notes.
Hmm.
And the version that we have in Cameo 14 is the notes version padded out with any text differences. So what I found from going through that section was basically there were three things he kept harping on throughout this guidance. One was that they should be what I call policing their minds. And by policing, I meant watching their minds for mistaken thoughts, basically thoughts of attack, and then moving to correct those thoughts. Well, that's response to temptation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Another theme that came through was that they should be constantly asking about every little thing. Well, that's one of our three habits. And the idea is that if they constantly police their minds would be in a state of love. If they constantly ask for guidance, they would be guided to do things that were helpful to others rather than hurtful. So both of those things supported a third thing, which was the keynote of that guidance, is that he wanted them to be constantly giving miracles. So it was the exact, and once you read this discourse on the chain of miscreation, you see him harping on those three things again and again and again. It's not like I've just tried to force them in there. They're there. And their relationship between them is pretty obvious too. The policing of your mind and asking for guidance, that's all there to support miracle giving. So his concept of the day they should have had is a day basically dominated by these three habits.
Isn't it wonderful how all of this hangs together? So Jesus says to Helen and Bill in particular guidance about their day, you should be doing these three things. And then more broadly, you look at the course itself, pull out the 18 references to the word habit, and you see the exact same three things.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I find particularly interesting about the habit references is they are scattered from the start of the course to the end, the very end of the course. So they're not things he said right next to each other. He just mentions habit here and there throughout the whole course, oftentimes with many chapters between the different references. And yet, when you add them all up and put them together, this very clear pattern emerges of these three habits. Just like when you analyze that chain of miscreation discourse, you see, oh my gosh, these three things. So it's exciting to
I
me,
know.
and I know to you too.
I know, because Jesus isn't going to give us the 3-point plan. He does, but you have to look for it. I guess that's what we have you for.
But when you look for it, it's like
It's
there's no
everywhere.
doubt. There's no doubt. It's absolutely clear. He wants you to form these three habits. He wants these three things to dominate your life.
And you said earlier that they're not in any particular order, but it feels like they could be, because if you are policing your mind and asking for guidance, your response to temptation, rather, you're doing your response to temptation practice, you're asking for guidance, that is what opens up more of a channel that allows the love to come through. So it feels like maybe there is an order to them. Would you agree with that or no?
Yeah, there kind of is. Basically, I mean, it's almost like response to temptation and asking for guidance are two legs that support. It's like bipod, not a tripod. Anyway, they support miracle giving because response to temptation means that you have love in your mind to give.
Mm-hmm.
And asking for guidance, it's quite striking how much throughout the course we aren't just asking for guidance for the sake of, our personal journey. We are doing that, but it's really striking how much it's clear that we're doing that so that our behavior that results can be helpful rather than hurtful.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel to me like there is an order to them. There's a, ready, aim, fire to it versus
Yeah,
a
there
fire,
is.
ready, aim.
Yeah.
So, how do you know which miracles to perform if you're not asking for guidance?
And
And
how do you have love to express if you aren't responding to temptation?
right, or how are you even in a place to know that how are you even ready to ask for guidance if you're not doing your response to temptation and bringing yourself back to peace? So,
That's true. That's true. But I think even more to the point, to give a miracle means to express love. To express love, you have to have love. If you aren't policing your mind and it's full of judgments and attack thoughts, you have no love.
right. Okay. Fascinating.
It's fascinating. And what is so exciting about this is you can see that here is the course basically setting before us a way of life. Between these three habits, we have a whole way of life. And there's no doubt that we are looking straight into his mind about this. This is the way of life he wants us to have, these three habits. So the question then is, will we do what it takes to form them?
Mm. But if they're Jesus's habits for us, why wouldn't we want to form them?
Well, I can give you an answer. I mean, yeah, there is no good answer to that, but I've been standing before these habits for a lot of years and putting energy into forming them, but also putting energy into their opposite. And when you do that, you don't really form the habit. You form a really weak semi habit that is
Mm-hmm.
competing with other habits,
Mm-hmm.
right, for the stage. And so the fact is that we want control. We want to lavish attention on ourselves. We want to let those judgments run rampant and fuel them rather than undermine them.
Well, then let us make this year be the year that we make habits with Jesus and hold ourselves accountable, all of us, for keeping them.
Absolutely. That's
And what a
definitely what I
different year
want.
it would
Yeah.
be.
If we really did that, it would be a different year. That would be the first year of a very different life.
That's a good place to end. Anything else that you want to say?
I think we'll end there. Yeah.
Yeah, really good. Okay, well, thank you, Robert, as always, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It's been great. Bye.